pretty good. Not many witches got a whole geological outcrop to themselves, even if this one was mostly covered in grass, and the grass was mostly covered in sheep. And today the sheep on the downs were left by themselves to do whatever it was that they did when they were by themselves, which would presumably be pretty much the same as they did if you were watching them. And the sheep, usually fussed and herded and generally watched over, were now of no interest whatsoever, because right here the most wonderful attraction in the world was taking place. Admittedly, the Scouring Fair was only one of the world's most wonderful attractions if you didn't usually ever travel more than about 4 miles from home. If you lived around the chalk, you were bound to meet everyone that you knew at the fair. Speaking as a witch, she knew them very well. It was quite often where you met the person you were likely to marry. The girls certainly all wore their best dresses, while the boys wore expressions of hopefulness and their hair smoothed down with cheap hair pomade, or, more usually, spit. Those who had opted for spit generally came off better, since the cheap pomade was very cheap indeed and would often melt and run in the hot weather, causing the young men not to be of interest to the young women, as they had fervently hoped, but to the flies, who would make their lunch off the boys' scalps. However, since the event could hardly be called the fair where you went in the hope of getting a kiss and, if your luck held, the promise of another one, the fair was called the Scouring. The Scouring was held over 3 days at the end of summer. For most people on the chalk it was their holiday. This was the 3rd day, and it was said that if you hadn't had a kiss by now, you might as well go home. Tiffany hadn't had a kiss, but after all, she was the witch. Who knew what they might get turned into? If the late summer weather was clement, it wasn't unusual for some people to sleep out under the stars, and under the bushes as well. And that was why, if you wanted to take a stroll at night, it paid to be careful, so as not to trip over someone's feet. Not to put too fine a point on it, there was a certain amount of what Nanny Ogg, a witch who had been married to 3 husbands, called making your own entertainment. It was a shame that Nanny lived right up in the mountains, because she would have loved the Scouring, and Tiffany would have loved to see her face when she saw the giant. Later on, Tiffany realised that all the witches had probably flown across the giant, especially since you could hardly miss him if you were flying from the mountains to the big city. He kind of stood out in any case. But in Nanny Ogg's case, she would probably turn around to look at him again. He, and he was quite definitely a he, there was no possible doubt about that, had been carved out of the turf thousands of years before. A white outline against the green, he belonged to the days when people had to think about survival and fertility in a dangerous world. Oh, and he had also been carved, or so it would appear, before anyone had invented trousers. In fact, to say that he had no trousers on just didn't do the job. His lack of trousers filled the world. You simply could not stroll down the little road that passed along the bottom of the hills without noticing that there was an enormous, as it were, lack of something, e.g. trousers, and what was there instead? It was definitely a figure of a man without trousers, and certainly not a woman. Everyone who came to the Scouring was expected to bring a small shovel, or even a knife, and work their way down the steep slope to grub up all the weeds that had grown there over the previous year, making the chalk underneath glow with freshness and the giant stand out boldly, as if he didn't already. There was always a lot of giggling when the girls worked on the giant. And the reason for the giggling, and the circumstances of the giggling, couldn't help but put Tiffany in mind of Nanny Ogg, who you normally saw somewhere behind Granny Weatherwax with a big grin on her face. She was generally thought of as a jolly old soul, but there was a lot more to the old woman. She had never been Tiffany's teacher officially, but Tiffany couldn't help learning things from Nanny Ogg. She smiled to herself when she thought that. Nanny knew all the old, dark stuff, old magic, magic that didn't need witches, magic that was built into people and the landscape. It concerned things like death and marriage and betrothals, and promises that were promises even if there was no one to hear them, and all those things that make people touch wood and never, ever walk under a black cat. You didn't need to be a witch to understand it. The world around you became more real and fluid at those special times. Nanny Ogg called it numinous, an uncharacteristically solemn word from a woman who was much more likely to be saying